We have two wonderful panelists with us today. First is Alina Sava, who is an education specialist at the World Bank based in Bucharest, Romania. She has spent more than 20 years designing, implementing, and evaluating education policies and programs across the globe. And she joined the Education Global Practice team back in 2013 after many years advising reforms specifically in Romania. Anna Pons is our other wonderful panelist, who is the project lead for the Global Teaching Insights team at the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills. The initiative is all about using video to advance research on how teaching varies across countries and what practices are most effective for actually raising student outcomes. She also has a lot of experience that she will share with us on researching effectiveness and indicators of quality and equity across, just in this context that she is related to us, 9 educational systems, and has written a report on equity and quality in education. So to get us started, just to make sure that we all know each other a little bit better and see where we're coming from, I hoped that each of you could just quickly say in less than a minute, what is your sort of proudest achievement thus far, the greatest impact you feel you've made at a multilateral through this kind of lens of work? And maybe we could start with you, Alina.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here with you, and I'm happy to share my personal journey or experience, not only at the global level, but also regional and local, because you can have a top-down approach and go from global to local, but you can have this bottom-up approach, and from level perspective, from local level perspective, you can bring good experience and good practice at the global level. So my personal or proudest accomplishment that I have recently is that I took COVID-19 as an opportunity, not as a challenge. And I worked online with people in teams at global level and tried to inform reports and research and provide really timely and good advice for the governments, especially on school reopening. This was my mantra this past 2 years, to keep schools open as much as possible and safely opening. So we had a joint framework for school reopening, we had global guidance, and then we prepared scenarios for schools in Romania, for example, in other countries. So we helped with this global level advice and then to local advice. Recently, we did a blog, planning amid uncertainty, reopening schools in Europe and Central Asia. And we were so happy to see that it surpassed the audience of our president blog. So it means that education is still in attention of many people, to large audience, to teachers, to students, and also to parents. So the pandemic is lasting longer than we predicted. And in the process, this crisis can be an opportunity. And we can introduce structural reforms of education. We need to re-engineer the education. And we should think that education is an ecosystem. So it's not only the schools that you need to protect and help and students inside, but it's an entire community that school serves. So this is what I learned, to keep close to what happens on the ground, because in the end, this is the where you really start seeing things. You see students that are learning better. You see parents that are happy that their students are safely in schools, and you see teachers that are motivated and are rewarded.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And I think that will be a theme today, the kind of the interface between what's happening on the ground and the kind of the systems discussion. So I'm excited to dive into that more. So Anna, over to you. There's a lot to share, but what are you perhaps proudest of?
Thanks, Adam, and hello, everyone. I hope that if you're having lunch, bon appetit. And I'm really excited to be part of this conversation today. Just to make things simple, because you've just given us 1 minute, maybe I can use the same anecdote. It's from a few years back, so not COVID related. And it's kind of the two sides of the same coin. For me, the biggest accomplishment is when people find the advice relevant and useful. And that you can see when they ask for your advice, when the press is not there, when there are no politics involved, So when it's really, they are really interested in what you can tell them. That's what for me an example of or something that makes me feel proud, or that makes me feel that we add value to their work. And for me, the greatest struggle is always when politics get involved and things get frustrated for reasons that have nothing to do with the interests of teachers, of students, and of schools. And the anecdote comes from a few years back when we had to spend 2 years engaging with the education minister of a country in Latin America and all the key stakeholders in the country in order to kind of do a stock-taking exercise to understand the opportunities and the challenges of the education system and to kind of help them craft a way forward. And the day that we were supposed to launch this report, the conclusions of this exercise, the union decided to boycott the event and walk away, which of course, as you know, teacher unions are a big partner in any reform. So that was a big, that was a big frustration. But at the same time, 2 weeks later, the union leader called me to tell me that, of course, this was kind of something private, but called me because he had seen this new OECD data, and he thought that that could be very interesting to help him make some points across with the education minister in their negotiations. So he wanted to have my advice on how to interpret it. Which kind of meant to me that we had built this very trustful relationship, and that I had managed to convey to him that we can add value by providing an international comparison on how this country compares to other ones. So for me, this is kind of the two sides of the same coin, which I guess that it's an example of this positive news and not so positive ones.
I can add to this struggle. I have another one. It's competing crisis. Guys, just to tell to a government to select between the crises and to see that education falls as a fourth priority, this is horrible. Imagine that we have a sanitary health crisis, right? And because it was pandemic, and it is. We had the workforce crisis. And then because people need jobs, so you cannot compete with jobs. And then you cannot compete with climate change because this is real and this is happening in the same time. We have now the transportation crisis, we have energy crisis, we have huge prices. So who would devote time for education? So this was really, we wanted education to not be the Cinderella of these days. That's why we promote it and said constantly, learning loss is here. Do something about this, because otherwise you'll regret in 10 years. You'll regret it really much more, because look at Korea. Korea invested in education, prioritized education. Look at Estonia. They did the same thing. So everything is possible. Invest in education and then everything it will pay off. And the second struggle that we have at a global level is the reliability and availability of data. It's so hard to compare when data are really different. Data sets that they collect. It's so hard. It's so easy to look at PISA and to have really the same pattern or the same structure and the same similar. And that's why maybe later I will give you more on that.
Thank you both. Thank you, Lina. No, I think it's wonderful to get at this question of value add and also the nature of trust and collaboration and whose voice matters. And I think I would actually love to dive into that to really unpack a bit more both of your experiences, because as you've already alluded to, you've done so much work in these spaces. So starting with you, Anna, perhaps, I introduced you with regard to the Teaching Insights project that you recently published a massive report on, which is really all about understanding what happens in teaching across the globe and understanding how that teaching affects actual student learning without kind of providing a prescriptive solution to how a teacher should teach. But I'm curious, kind of backing up a bit from that experience, and feel free to share whatever you'd like on that too. What was your ambition when you were collecting such a kind of diverse international data set, when you were doing this cross-national work? What did you hope would be the applied policy outcome? And I think that you could, since you have so much experience, also link this to just the question of the value add of multilaterals as a whole too. I'm curious for your thoughts.
Thanks, Adam. Perhaps before delving into the video study, I would like to perhaps situate the audience on what is that we do at the OECD, because we measure things to facilitate comparisons. And Alina has just mentioned PISA. That's probably what we are best known for, because there are 80 countries participating. But we also conduct surveys like TAVIS, which kind of is a survey of the teaching profession and a school leadership one. We also measure the skills of adults, the skills of, we also measure at early childhood, and we are increasingly trying to measure non-cognitive outcomes, like in a social and emotional survey. So we measure to help countries compare themselves to see what is possible and to kind of gauge progress. That's one thing that we do, and I think we are quite well known for. But we also do other things at the OECD. We provide countries with comparative policy analysis, which basically tries to bring together the best research that is out there with also in-depth country reviews, where we try to understand policies and how they work in practice. And we put all this together in this comparative policy analysis. Like one recent one that was published was on resources at the school level, or evaluation and assessment. A third thing that we do is kind of prospective exercises of looking into the future. So bringing key stakeholders together to brainstorm on what will be the future like, to exchange ideas and try to imagine the future, help them anticipate what is coming. And the fourth thing that we do is provide education ministers with direct advice. So they may be interested in doing a reform of, I don't know, of a schooling or a teacher policies, and they come to us and say, hey, what is happening in OECD countries in terms of teacher policies? What advice would you give us on what types of reforms do we need in our country? So we do these 4 different things. And I've actually been engaged in all of these things during my 11 years at the OECD. For this one that you asked about, which is the video study, which is the survey, what we actually aim to do there is try to go one step further from indirect measures of what happens in the classroom and on classroom processes. What we usually use are teacher surveys, student surveys, or a student test. And what we wanted to do is try new means like video and the coding of artifacts to better understand whether this could help us or provide a new understanding of differences in teaching. What we observe from our surveys is that there are differences in how teachers teach across countries, but we need to better understand these differences. And we thought that by making them visible and coding them, that could help us better understand these different country approaches. One of the areas where we think that there is a lot, and I'm finishing with this, to learn internationally is actually around all these classroom processes. And because we haven't been able to capture them well, we are not able to compare them, to analyze them, and to come up with interesting insights. And it's not just at the international level. In many countries, classrooms are still black boxes, are closed. It's very hard to get in there. So kind of our bet into the future would be that if we are able to open the classrooms to better understand what goes on in this teaching and learning process, then we might be able to come with new insights to help policymakers think about new policies that can be more supportive and lead to better outcomes for our students.
That's fantastic. And thank you for the OECD kind of overview as well. I'm curious then, to what extent do you think that you were able to sort of live up to that challenge, live up to that task that you set for yourself of, empowering teachers, ministers, leaders, whoever around the world to really imagine different educational futures by way of seeing different practices enacted in classrooms? Do you have any examples of how leaders, teachers, others were able to use these data in a way that maybe goes above and beyond, as you noted, PISA or TALIS or other international surveys?
Just a couple of examples. So for example, when the PISA results were published in Germany, there was a huge national surprise and national debate, like we need to do something. And PISA is not going to tell you what you have to do, but PISA can generate this shock of we need to do something because there are other countries that in this way of measuring things seem to be doing better than us. So we can help generate this shock. or it can also help set ambitions. Like, for example, former Colombian Minister of Education, like 5 years ago, she set the goal that Colombia should be the first country in PISA by 2025. So it can help set the horizon, it can help you compare with others, and that can help add pressure, whether nationally to get things across with your different constituencies, or internationally to advance on the global agenda. So I don't think that we are, or I wouldn't say that we are super successful in doing so. What we basically try to do is respond to the needs of countries, and they seem to be interested in having this type of comparisons because this helps them in their own national debates.
Fantastic. And so one last follow-up question before throwing it over to Alina, specifically for the Teaching Insights project. Thinking about, as I think you noted, the idea that, again, we're getting beyond just discrete metrics, beyond just kind of numerical outputs, and beyond, I think, just a really quantifiable vision of learning, but one that is much more descriptive and perhaps holistic. In what ways have you seen teachers, governments, others actually using this for the purposes of, I don't know, perhaps transforming teaching and learning toward more holistic, whole child, student-centered practices? Is that something that you're seeing? And if not, I'm curious if there are any major challenges that are still in the way. And I imagine there are many, and I would pass that to Alina afterward.
It's a hard question because we actually launched last year, just 1 year ago, well, less than a year ago. And as you know, education systems have been busy with everything but change. And we launched at a time where classrooms were closed. So whilst we are looking into the classrooms, I don't think that the period has been the best one. The way in which we would like policymakers to engage with it and to think about it is actually to use these common frames, because the videos that we have collected, for the first time, we not only have data saying Shanghai is achieving the result, and Germany is achieving this other result, and Mexico is achieving that other result. For the first time, we not just have numbers. For the first time, we also have video examples. And these video examples are just one example, one illustration, but can provide a common frame to have discussions around pedagogy in new, novel ways. So what we are doing at the moment is engaging with leading experts in observation and mathematics to go one step beyond what we did with the data in the video study and try to distill this complexity that we are observing in the classroom. So we still need to digest it a bit more so that it can be actionable, but what we observe in the video study already gives a very clear picture and underlines the importance to policymakers to further explore these differences in teaching approaches across countries. In the video study, we just look at one curricular topic. We only look at quadratic equations, and we did so because we wanted to avoid, we wanted to focus on teaching practices. And we knew that curriculums differ across countries. So we don't want that all this disruption, all this noise from the curriculum to get into what we were observing. That's why we focus on one single topic. And you would be surprised to see that for this one single topic, there are different ways of teaching it. So that kind of makes the point that we still have a lot to learn internationally. And I'm not sure that this means that there are better ways to teach in one country than another one. But I think that exploring the differences can help us understand the scope and spectrum of possibilities. And I believe that's something enriching.
That's wonderful. Thank you for trying to distill the complexity of all that you're doing too for us, because I know that there's so many opportunities and avenues here. And I would wonder too, you know, as you're moving forward, if you know, you would like to share more insights with us around how it is that these are what you might have learned from kind of a researcher's point of view about how you're controlling for the noise, as you put it. You know, you said kind of taking away the content piece because of the massive diversity of content differences, you know, across contexts. But how you were thinking about the kind of key components of difference across nations. But we can save that because I want to give Alina the chance to first. I would imagine you'd like to respond to some of what Anna has said, and then I have many questions for you. Do you want to respond first, Alina? No? Okay, perfect. Well, then I would like to dive in to asking you about your context so that we can also get familiar with what you're doing. You've worn a lot of hats as well, but the two that I'm most familiar with are kind of thinking about this Romanian secondary education project, thinking about ROSE and this massive project for sort of transforming Romanian secondary education and the tertiary pipelines, and also data collection around SABRE, thinking about, you know, what data can inform our secondary education practices. That's what I'm thinking about for you, but I would love you to kind of introduce your work a little bit and tell us what have been your greatest learnings around how you as a multilateral have or have not been able to make that sort of actionable and useful for your constituents.
So I really loved what Anna said, and I felt that I have a friend in another institution because there are so many similarities, but also some differences. For example, the World Bank is a development bank. So in principle, we lend money, or we give money for free, like in IDA, to support development in those countries. But we have a twin goal to respect and to work for. It's reducing poverty and sharing prosperity, which is kind of difficult. So we work more with low-income countries and with middle-income countries, and less with high-income countries. More with high-income countries, we take advice. So in addition to support these programs and these reforms with money, we do a lot of advisory services recently. So we do research, or we take research from OECD and use it for giving advice. Also, we developed globally some knowledge products like Teach Instrument. This is a classroom observation instrument that is for free. And it's so good to see what happens in the classroom. Speaking about teachers, because we touch upon how to assess teachers, are they qualified? In Romania, all of them are qualified. But we don't know exactly what happens in the classroom. So we need to use this instrument and to observe the classroom and look at the social-emotional skills development of kids, to look at the classroom climate, because it should be positive, to encourage especially the vulnerable kids, to look at how much they stay on task. All these are good elements, and we need to understand how to help teachers better. So we need to be in the classrooms to see what happens. So you take these instruments that the bank developed, is for free, and you need to provide advice to a government. What do we do with the instruments? So we realized that we have all kinds of instruments at the global level, like SABER approach for better results in education. This is looking at the benchmark policies around the world and gives you some points, and it tells you, you are here at the emerging status, here you are more developed or more very developed. And then we need to take all these instruments and provide not only assessment and policy guidance. This government needs second step. They need hand-holding. They need support in implementation. They need really preparing a different kind of instruments and more support on the local level. So that's why we take these instruments, for example, and we prepare the self-paced course for Moldova and for Romania. A self-paced course for teachers to take this part and then to learn with videos, with new content. So we try to be innovative and do things in the context of these days. Because education, it will not be traditional as it was. We need to have this new hybrid that is really difficult, because hybrid, it means to be at the same time in both places. And it's kind of difficult, not only for learning, but also for working experience, it's really difficult. And for me, I really relate to learning environments like working environments, because they are quite similar. So we do this support more in the countries. For example, for Saber, we took Saber workforce, for example, from the policy level to actually support the training providers with just-in-time training, how to do it for their business. So this is, I think, this is a good thing. And then with the ROSE project, this Romanian secondary education project, imagine that we started before pandemic. We financed 200 million euros to invest in students to go to higher education, because what we wanted is them to complete education and to go beyond, and to stay as much as possible in schools. So we invested in school grants. We provide remedial support, tutoring. What happened in the pandemic? What our kids needed to recover learning loss? Exactly what the project aimed. In addition to that, we provide also digital devices, because we realize that kids are at home and some of them are very poor, because Romania is a two-tailed story. We have the greatest inequality in Europe. We have an urban-rural divide. We have a digital divide. So we need to support vulnerable students. And this is what we do. And Roma. So this is what we do with Romanian secondary education. And still with the grants and with money, it was very complicated as a mechanism. In addition to that, now we try to support the current reforms, because EU pumps money in Romania. So we need to be there and help them target better, because Romania needs money. We really underfunded education, like chronically. So for the past 20 years, we are with 3% or lower than 3% of the GDP in education. This is really something. What to use this money? 90% of this money are going for teacher salaries. And then you have something for current cost, because you need to pay the electricity or the heating stove, because some schools have the stoves in the classrooms. And then what else for development or for investment? Nothing. So we need now to be very cautious and use the last opportunity that we have with EU funds and use it targeting the vulnerable students. So this is what we do. And this is ROSE, and these are other projects. And this is not only in Romania, it happens also in Moldova, in Croatia, in Montenegro, in North Macedonia, and also in Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan.
I'm curious, and first of all, you just mentioned, I think we have an echo here, this diversity of the context, right, that you're kind of working across. And also the massive challenge of doing any of this work in Romania specifically. Can you give us some examples of times when, as the World Bank, when you were looking at the SABER data, you were looking at these international assessments and international programs, and you realized these things would not be contextually relevant for Romania or for Kyrgyzstan or for wherever you might be looking at? How were you assessing, as a World Bank expert, the relevance and the utility of these international insights for your specific context? Could you walk us through that a little bit?
The good thing is that we are used not only for Romania. Look at this global context. Now I work in Romania, but in fact, I'm in a global team. So we work with colleagues from India. We peer review their programs, and when some instruments are relevant and some policies and some measures are relevant for other countries, we take those ideas. We work in teams, in global teams. Being exposed to different culture is very relevant. Of course, Romania is not Finland. So I went to Finland and I felt that this is a different world in education. I wanted to move there for education. But also I realized that you cannot take Finland and Romania make exactly the same thing. It's impossible. But you can take the good things that Finland has and you can promote those at your extent. It's also about demographics. A big country needs to be compared with another big country. I can take something from Estonia. I would love that. But Romania has a different demographics. We are 20 million and it's so hard to scaling up programs. And this is an interesting challenge. But going back to Finland, in Finland, the profession is attractive. In Finland, you are proud to be a teacher. In Romania, you are not so proud to be a teacher because you are not paid you are not paid in high levels, only when you are getting retired. So after 40 years of staying in the profession, you would be well paid. So at entry level, you need to have some better standards. So you need to increase the level of competition, but also you need to reward those young generations that are coming into teaching. You need to reward them. They cannot volunteer all the time, right? We ask them to volunteer. It's not quite like that. We have a young generation that waits to our doors, and they need to be considered, not only in education, but also in research. There is an entire young generation that is really willingly to work with us. And what I could observe is that it's good to be gender balanced, and I'm happy to see here that we are two females and one male. So we are more than usual. And then you need young, you need old, you need everyone, and you need diversity. It's so good to be exposed and to learn together. So you take this piece of advice from a country that it works in your country, but what you need to do as a priority is to go on government, to go to your education minister on a daily basis mainly, and to keep constantly giving the same advice. You know, it's like parenting. You tell to your kid the same thing for 10 years, and when he will be adult, he will do what he learned from you, not before. So you need to practice that and to take this time to introduce change. Change is not something that happens overnight. And the education systems are those that are changing very hard because there is an inertia. There is a constant resistance to change. They don't want to go in this new hybrid online thinking and digital innovative way, and it's not productive without having your teachers on board. So step-by-step thinking and doing proper consultation with everyone and engaging people in your advice is so good. Otherwise, you would promote some advice that nobody will consider.
I really like that point, and this sort of echoes what you had said. When we were talking offline before this event about the power of collaboration, and I like that. We can come back to that at the end too. So I'm curious for you then, Anna. I'm sure a lot of this resonates, but how do you think about this challenge of policy borrowing, which, just kind of to define it, is really transferring policies or programs or approaches from one context to another? There's obviously softer versions of this, like learning from policies and then applying that to the data in your context. But with your kind of advisor hat on or with a researcher hat on, how do you at the OECD approach this kind of question of transference? And what are the kind of key criteria that you consider before you go to transfer, advise, or learn about policies?
That's a very good question, because I'm not sure we transfer advice or transfer evidence. I think that our role, or I see our role more as to inspire, in the sense of we are sitting in Paris, because the OECD doesn't have country offices, and the only thing that we sell are ideas that come, or ideas, when I say ideas, I mean knowledge, practice, examples, policies, whatever we produce. The only thing we sell are all these thoughts or knowledge. We don't give loans, we have no interest whatsoever. So the only thing, and we don't monitor what they do also. So the only thing we help them with are giving them additional ideas to consider when making policy decisions. And we see our roles as enhancing their vision and helping bring expertise on what has happened in other parts of the globe to their constituency. There are issues of context, there are issues of financial, of political, so we don't see our role as this country should be doing this. What we do whenever we engage in any direct advice to a country is first talk to all the stakeholders to better understand why something is happening, why the country is so back, or why universities have that much autonomy in that country. So we try to better understand why is that the case by talking to all the stakeholders. And then what we do is we bring evidence on this is what happens in most OECD countries, or these countries by doing these reforms seem to have obtained these results, and so that we can enhance their vision of this is what is happening here. Nothing else seems possible because this is what we have always done, and there are all these other constituents that are against any change. But then we say, look, but this country had a similar situation and they actively managed to change it. So it is possible. So we kind of bring inspiration through new ideas and hope because other countries have managed to undertake those reforms. That's the role and the way I see the value that we can add to countries. We don't help them in saying, this is what you should be doing because this is what is most appropriate to their context, because they are the ones that know their context best. So that's something that we are very, very reluctant to engage with. And as we don't set or define interventions that are concrete or specific, if you look at our recommendations, they are very high level. They will be basically telling you, you should invest more in education. What does this mean? Well, figure it out. I'm joking, of course, I'm taking it to the extreme, but it's very, very high level, trying to provide some pointers to spur thinking in new directions by bringing this international evidence and expertise, but it's not providing very, very concrete advice that it's fully actionable and that indeed might run into the risk then of not being appropriate or relevant for a constituency.
That's fantastic. And I think you've actually already touched upon a few of the questions that are in the chat, but I wanted to start with the first one because it follows up on your point about, I think both of your points about maintaining kind of constant contact with leaders, with constituents on the ground in order to develop these sorts of advising strategies. And Hiba asked, I was wondering how frequently does the OECD conduct needs assessments? And I think her question here is really about how often do you talk to teachers, students, or other participants and actually rapidly update your knowledge about the situations on the ground such that you can conduct really meaningful on-time policy advising? Are you talking in the day-to-day? Are you talking in the month-to-month? And how are you ensuring that the advice that you're giving is relevant to the actual situation on the ground? I don't know which one of you would like to maybe speak first to that question of needs assessment.
It's kind of a hard question because I would say that when the way that we work and our procedures are different depending on the type of work that we do. So in our surveys, we don't really talk to the teachers in the sense that we gain their insights through the surveys, but it's actually our national partners like the Evaluation Institute, the one that will be implementing them. In the direct advice that we do, as well as in the country reviews, the types of work that we do where we do provide advice, because in the surveys we don't provide advice. When we do provide advice in that sense of recommendations, we engage in processes where we go and visit the schools and talk to teachers, talk to the students, talk to the school leadership, and talk to as many stakeholders as we can in urban areas, in remote areas. But of course, the picture that we get is incomplete. It's not possible to interview all the stakeholders, as you can imagine. And for this type of assessments, whenever we've completed the exercise, which typically would last 1 year or 2 years, then we make it public. But we only provide advice when we have gone into an in-depth review of the system and conducted all these interviews with the stakeholders. So not just use our data or the evidence that exists, but also interview the stakeholders. We will not be republishing this 5 years later without having engaged in exactly the same exercise of going into the depth on what is happening. So indeed, I agree with, I think, what's the name? I forgot the name, but I agree with Hiva that the needs change, the context change, not the least the political context changes. So I think it will be very risky for us to engage in providing the same advice without having looked at what is happening in the country. So that's not something that we do. Whenever we provide policy advice, it's because there is an exercise behind of looking into the depth of it.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful answer. And Alina, I would invite you to respond as well if you'd like to. And also maybe perhaps specifically think about the timeliness question, especially as you noted in this world of COVID, where data, unfortunately, is going to maybe become rapidly outdated in just a few weeks, days, months. How do you maintain a sort of up-to-date snapshot of the realities on the ground such that you can make actionable advice and develop informed programming?
And to put more on that, imagine that we are working in countries that don't believe in science, okay? So many of the countries, they don't believe in science. So sometimes like low-income countries or even Romania, we have facts, we have research that was done yesterday, was launched. So when you don't believe in science, the importance is not on the research that you bring on, not on the data that you really base your policies, but how you pack the message. So communication skills are really relevant these days, much more than data skills sometimes. And we need to pack this message very well. So it's important how you tell the story. And I want to share with you an example what we did, because we prepare safer, inclusive, and sustainable school project. And we wanted to intervene in schools to resolve the seismic risk, but also to do some inclusivity and to have more Roma and more disabled students and intervene in the schools altogether. So without parallel programs. And then what we used with the government and with the audience when we publicly consulted. I would show you one. I want to show you some, let me see. Okay, share. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, so we engage cartoonists. We engage cartoonists because we need humor. We need humor these days to really engage them in a different way. So look at this, this picture. Instead of fixing the buildings, we invested in new school uniform. So we mock the government on what they are thinking when looking at the next one. Education budget. Relax, it's just data. Quiet, please. I'm looking for the school budget. And then, but we had such perfect safety laws, and look the reality. And we have no funding for disasters that have not yet happened, you know, because this was happened also in the pandemic, right? If you cover your eyes, you can make it go away. So we use this system, stop share. We use this type of new engagement, and it was fun. And the government liked it. Of course, we didn't put anything offensive, but we needed to go to the limit to make them understand the importance of investing now and not later. You need a timely response. You don't need them to stay longer. You see, sometimes countries see PISA results and they are baffled. So yes, these are the results. But then you need to do something with those PISA results. You need to intervene, you need to do some policy actions. It's real, and you need to be committed. It's very hard when in countries you have political volatility. And this is really the challenge that we have in many countries. There is such a high turnover of government that is so hard to re-engage and also to continue reform. So I do see this challenge. And that's why when you approach stakeholders, you need to go also to the citizen level. And EU policies usually are around citizens. That's why our policies are around students and teachers. This is my bread and butter. we have to do something for students, teachers, and also their parents, because more and more parents are involved in the decisions that they are taken for the schooling of and learning of their kids. And we need to pay attention, because we don't want all of them to go to UK, right? We need to keep some students in their own countries to be happy, to learn, and to succeed on the local labor market, because you need workforce. We don't want to compromise what we have. And in Romania, this is a struggle.
I think that you're answering Morgan's question in some way that was directed at Anna in part. So Morgan, please write in the chat if you'd like to ask your question again or in the same way. But I think she was kind of getting at this question of what are alternative means of sharing findings and insights and advice other than just a 100, 200 page policy report or brief or something along those lines. So I think cartoons are an interesting way, and the idea of directly interacting with the central stakeholders who are parents and teachers and students on the ground is a kind of creative way to get at this. So again, Morgan, please feel free to ask a question again if you want me to share it out. I think this actually, I want to quickly, before moving on to the questions that Anna is responding to, or Anna, do you have something you'd like to add briefly?
Well, I wanted to add something, because we talk about assessing the needs and getting other voices. And I do want to mention something, which is that something that we are trying to do now at the OECD is try to crowdsource directly from teachers their perspectives. So for example, right now we are running a campaign together with UNESCO and Education International, that, as you know, it's the International Federation of Teacher Unions. We're bringing together like 32 million teachers from around the world. So we are crowdsourcing insights on how are teachers teaching for climate action. So as Alvina said before, I mean, reforms can no longer be top down. We need to increasingly try to find new ways to better understand what goes on in the grassroots, in the classrooms, and we're exploring new ways. One way was using this video study in a very rigorous research setting. Another avenue that we're exploring is through crowdsourcing exercises. Of course, the levels of reliability and rigor are different than the ones that we achieve in our surveys that are representative at the national level, but it is a new avenue that we are exploring and that we think that has a lot of potential in the future. It's trying to use these digital tools and the fact that right now we might be international, but we can reach all these teachers and school leaders in the different schools and in the different countries. And how can we actually tap into all this expertise to find new ways and new sorts of data to provide more timely, maybe not advice, but insights on what happens in education across countries.
Thank you. No, I was actually just about to ask a question on local voice and how it is that you can embed that into this policy advising and data collection process. So I wonder, Lena, if you had any reaction to that before we move on to another set of questions, but I'm kind of wondering, how do local voices and concerns shape this question of contextualization? So when we're thinking about policy borrowing, when we're thinking about data collection, how do you as a sort of individual World Bank employee get at these local leaders and these local constituent voices?
You remember how Anna started with the Teachers Union. Think about that we are doing system country diagnosis. And we need to engage everyone in the discussion, private sector, employers, unions, ministries, representatives, association of parents, of students, everyone. And imagine that you have unions in these discussions. And often the opinions are contradictory. So often you need to bring everyone on the same page, and this is very difficult. So you need communication expert. You need to engage really in longer time. So you need to be consistent with the messages. You need to take the global advice to see what the country needs, but also to listen to the people, because they can tell you things that you don't know. And it's very hard when you do this online, right? Because in online meetings, you will not have the same level of honesty. So to have an honest discussion, sometimes people prefer face-to-face meeting. And imagine interaction during this time. It's so hard, it was so hard, and it is still to interact in countries where you have a low vaccination rate. Because you can, I am, for example, I'm in a post-COVID situation. I just got COVID from my son's school. While giving the advice of and promoting school remaining fully open. Okay, so karma sometimes it goes back to you. And but this is important. The dialogue is all the time important, even though it is with pros and cons, because this is the way you learn. We are still the critical friend in here. We are still the neutral friend. And this is our role, to keep everyone engaged and to find a solution that pleases the most of them. It's not only, but imagine that you want to go in a country and you want a full day schooling in primary education. What it means when you want a full day schooling? It means that students will stay longer in school, 8 hours, but they probably will not drop out in 8th grade. They will continue education. They will complete education if you do that. But to do that, you need to pay teachers maybe better. You need to have tutoring programs. You need to diagnose kids to see where they are. Maybe you come with new instruments like teaching at the right level that was used in India. You need to engage funds, and you need to reform. So you engage early all the people in the conversation, and you have buy-in. Without engaging early into the conversation, the people that really matters for the scope and the purpose of the program or projects or policy or reform, then you don't have the buy-in. So, step by step you build, although you know that there will be some pushback, but you just continue to do because you work for the greater good. This is in my mind forever. I work for the greater good. I work for kids. I don't work for some politicians or for some governments. I work for kids. And that's why I do that for the past 20 and something years.
No, I love that, Alina. Thank you. I'm glad that we're getting, so I have two final questions for you. And one is kind of getting at that question of change and buy-in and systems. So thank you for bringing it up again and recentering us on what this is all about, right? Before we get to that last kind of closer question though, I wanted to sort of meld together the questions of Bridget and Idrim, which Anna, I believe, has been responding to in the chat. But basically it goes back to what you, Alina, had alluded to at the start of our conversation, which is that data is a massive challenge. There's promise in it and there's a challenge in it. And Anna noted that, OECD is trying to build new ways to look at data, what teachers are doing in the classroom, as opposed to just what they self-report on a test or what their students' mathematics scores are. I'm curious if you could help us look toward the future. Adrian and Bridget both pointed to the potential problems of using something like a PISA that's really rigid and quantitative, measuring only one aspect of student achievement for setting national policies and for advising governments who are going to take that as kind of their creed. What do you think is the future? Where should we be going, and where do you think we are going with regard to new forms of data and assessment that maybe get at whole child learning and that could help multilaterals like yourself to really do much more perhaps meaningful policy advising work? So data, policy advising, whole child education, what do you think? Perhaps Anna, would you like to start?
Thanks, Adam. We're at the moment discussing on our program of work and budget for the next biennium. So that's really at the heart of what we are trying to do now, engaging with countries to better understand what it is that they would like us to do. One thing to mention here that sometimes we forget is that whatever we do at the international organizations is because our member countries give us the mandate to do that. So we really depend on countries, and they are the ones that steer our work and that tell us you should be looking into this or this other thing that we find important. At the moment, we are looking into different things. So one of the things that we think that will be worth exploring, it's these non-probabilistic samples. It's this type of more timely data through a sample that might not be representative at the national level. So that's definitely an avenue that will be interesting to explore. Another avenue that we're exploring and that I mentioned in the chat is it's the measurement of non-cognitive skills, and in particular on social and emotional skills. That's also one of our, I guess, big bets for the future. And in terms of other types of administrative data, we are trying to also see whether we can have more disaggregated data. At the moment, we mostly publish data at the national level, but some countries have already good regional data sets, and maybe we can go one level down and have more disaggregated data, or have administrative data that typically has a lag. If you look at Education at a Glance, which is our main publication for administrative data, you will see that there is a lag of 2 years. So that's kind of a big period. So we're trying to see how can we make this more timely. We've also engaged in kind of exploration exercises through the use of job vacancies data from the job portals like Monster or LinkedIn or whatever, to exploit this data to come up with indicators on what is happening now from this sample data. So we are exploring different avenues to, again, provide more relevant and timely data to policymakers.
Love that. Thank you so much for sharing that and giving us some insight on where we're going. As we're out of time, in fact, I do have another question, so I invite you to stay for longer. But Alina, do you want to respond to the same question of kind of where are we going from here with regard to data, indicators, evidence, and actually getting at agendas and advising that are not constraining us to kind of traditionalist systems of education focused on math and reading, perhaps, and nothing else?
So I go back again to collaboration. So I have, this stupid thing that it really bothers me, that we don't collaborate as much as we could. And it's also on data. We have to collaborate more. So what we do now is that we engage more in sharing data with other institutions like UNICEF and Johns Hopkins Institute, and we provide global tracker, for example, on school reopening. So we input data at the country level, and we shared the responsibilities. So some countries are for the World Bank, some countries for UNICEF. So in this way, we collect data and we have the same set of data. You know how important it is to not work in parallel, and how stupid it is to say, look, this is my research, this is your research. No, we need to come up with terms. So in Romania, we did the same thing. We had a system, an education management information system that collected data on students, but also National Institute of Statistics that collected data of students in parallel. So of course, total number of students in Romania, all the time we had different numbers because the ministry collected some other set of data through school inspectorates. And we said, no more. Let's have an agreement between institutions and let's collect data from a single source. And this is what we helped them to do. And this is what we do at the global level as well. We have different data at the national level and the regional level and at the global level. So no, we need to find a way and simplify things. And also this is with the assessment that are so different. And when you try to, for example, we have a human capital index because we try to see how our students can be productive in the future as future workers. And we wanted to understand their productivity when they have full services, full quality education and health services. And we combine and we come up with the composite indicators. We used enrollment in all these countries. We had enrollment, and we factoring in the PISA or the TMSS or whatever national assessment is in there. So, or stunting data for kids, because this was also relevant, but this is not collected everywhere. So we have this limitation in this human capital index. However, it says a lot on where is Romania vis-a-vis Moldova, vis-a-vis Finland, that we are Finland, they are productive 80%, they will reach when they will be adult, while Romanian 58. So imagine the difference, and this is important because we want to send this message: invest more in health and education services, invest more in this, otherwise we will not develop.
I like that we're ending perhaps with a reflection on multilaterals, how we can get even more collaborative with multilaterals. So thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. This was incredibly enriching. Every time I wish that we had extended this by 30 minutes or an hour or more to keep talking. So we're going to have you back and maybe do, specific country discussions, because what's interesting is we've come from two very different kind of regional demographic contexts, but both doing such diverse work. So again, many conversations to come. I thank you both so much. And I invite you, of course, to stay, respond in the chat, respond here if you'd like as well. And if you're amenable, we can also share details of your projects and things like that in our email that will go out after this with recording of this and invitations to our upcoming events. The next one is going to be at the end of November, with former Brazilian ministers of education who are going to talk about kind of Latin American context and where we're going from here. So again, thank you so much to Anna and Alina for your wonderful insights. And Anna has posted her email very kindly. And again, also thank you to Alina for braving post-COVID recovery with us to be here. Again, thank you everyone, and stay tuned for more from CIRIP.